the spiritual home that we've created here in Lawrence-Cedarhurst, and once we put this on the internet, we will hopefully transform the world into a better place to live through exposure to our Jewish sages and their teachings. Let me just go quickly into the nature of the shir, and then we will start right away. I will give you a little bit of advance warning. Tonight is a little exceptional. We started a little bit late. I like to start right at 8:30. But we will start right on time. And the format is very simple. I'm going to take just half an hour to speak about the historical background of the individual that we'll be studying, to try and place, for the most part, we can say his ideas in their historical context. And then the second half hour will be when we really get into the material, when rabbis Teitelbaum and Trump in alternating weeks will actually guide us through a session of learning their texts. The goal of this series is to enrich our appreciation of these fantastic thinkers and give us a sense of how they have shaped our Weltanschauungen and how they have created the Jewish world in which we now live. The topic for today is, of course, if we're going to speak about any of the great thinkers in our shared heritage, we have to begin with Rabban Shel Yisrael, the acronym for the great thinker Rashi. His true name, of course, is Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, Solomon, the son of Yitzchak. But he is really the founding father of the way we learn text. In fact, there's an expression that in order to learn Torah, you must really learn it with two fingers. One firmly lodged in the actual biblical text itself, and the other in the commentary of Rashi. And learning the text in two ways gives us this unique, nuanced way to read the text, which creates an entirely different way of looking at the world, Jewishly, through the eyes of this great commentator. His years are 1040 to 1105. He is one of the greatest of the Ashkenazic figures. He is a rather liminal character in many ways, occupying the borderline chronologically and in some senses geographically. So let's have a very quick look at some of the major features of his life, and then we'll turn to the texts themselves. Placing him within context, and I realize, by the way, looking around the room, that there's a great deal of highly educated people here who have had 8, 20, 25 years of full-time Jewish education. I apologize if much of this is going to be basic review for you, but for the rest of us, I'd like to give you some more serious background information that will be useful. But perhaps I'll just start with a small personal anecdote, in particular because I have my brilliant son Boaz here filming, and I don't think I've ever told him this story. But I recall distinctively one of my personal most powerful connections with Rashi was when I was studying in yeshiva in Israel, and I came to Torah as an adult. I was in my mid-20s when my wife convinced me that I should really be studying much more Torah. And I remember being so frustrated just trying to work through a basic Rashi on a Gemara and feeling so terrible that, Rashi is something that is learned by young children and old people alike with great facility, and there's so many ways you can approach it, and I simply could not crack open this Rashi, and I felt tremendous, literally tears of frustration. I literally cried with frustration, thinking, how is it that I'm in graduate school already, I'm studying for my PhD, I published articles, and I can't figure out Rashi, and I felt so awful and frustrated, and tears ran down my face. The next morning, when I went back to Shir, Rashi was all of a sudden my best friend. All of a sudden, everything that Rashi said, it felt like he was just standing behind me, whispering in my ear, guiding me through the Gemara, and it was a transformational moment. I've always felt very close to Rashi and to textual study, really, as a result of that particular day in Yerushalayim. And I feel like maybe in a strange way I kind of channeled the spirit of Rashi, because that's really his goal as a teacher, is to give us access to the material, hold our hand, walk us through the text to a degree which Art Scroll only, in a pale manner tries to imitate. Anyway, here we go. Let's go back to the timing. So the periodization, we have These are groups of scholars by Jewish historiographic convention. The Tanaim refer to scholars who were associated with the compilation of the Mishnah, basically to the early 3rd century of the Common Era. Then you have the Amoraim, who are associated with the Talmud, to the 6th century. A group of scholars known as the Geonim, primarily in Babylon, to the 9th century. And then you have the Rishonim, which is a very large group of scholars from the late 9th century to the 15th century. This is when Rashi, of course, lived. He's one of the early Rishonim, an extremely important one. And then afterwards you have the Acharonim in the 19th century. Everything after the 19th century is not really worth talking about, so we're not even going to mention it. Rashi is often associated with this script, the so-called Rashi script. It's a little bit of a misnomer. He wrote in the typical Ashkenazic script of the day. This is just a printing convention that is essentially like italics. Regular square or Assyrian script is what we're used to in most of our prayer books and other standard Hebrew textbooks. The Rashi script was just a little bit of a cursive. It looked kind of pretty, and it helped in typographical conventions to place two different typefaces on the same page so you could distinguish between the main text and the commentary. For those of you who may be somewhat stymied by Rashi's script, it's really not that hard. It's almost identical to the regular script, except for a handful of letters, like the letter Aleph, which has kind of a flag on the top. The letter Shin is really quite different. The final Mem and a Samech are quite different, but otherwise it's really not so hard to learn. I'll tell you one also personal funny story. I wrote a small book on the Talmud that was published by Feldheim Publishers. I'm very proud of saying, by the way, I think I'm the only person ever to be published by both Harvard University Press and Feldheim Publishers. That's why I work for Touro College. But the Feldheim, I had a tremendous editor there. We went through 19 drafts before it went to print. We even had about a 3,000 word exchange on whether the word should be chule or chula in a particular part, whether or not a particular nekuda should be different. But there was one glaring mistake when I talked about reading Rashi's script in this book. I said all the letters are the same except for these underlined letters, and we forgot to put in the underlining. And to this date, until I release this video on the internet, no one has found that mistake. I don't know what that means. I guess people are a little too afraid to learn Rashi's script. But anyways, there it is. It really isn't Rashi's script. It's just because the fact that Rashi is usually printed in that script that it has taken that name, but it has nothing to do with him personally. Now, I mentioned that he was one of the generation of scholars called Rishonim, literally the first ones. And the kind of intellectual work, the kind of scholarship that the Rishonim were engaged in were extremely important for really setting the Grundlage, the foundations for what would be done in later generations. The kind of things they did, many of them paid a special attention to textual integrity. Is the text that we have correct? Are there scribal errors? Are there variant manuscripts? Things like that. Rabbeinu Hananel is a great example. The grammarians like Saruk and Ben Dunash spent a lot of time trying to explain exactly what the Hebrew text meant on a grammatical level. And of course that's quite significant because the Jews are no longer speaking Hebrew as a native language. It's always a secondary scholarly language, so you have to have grammarians to really understand what's going on. Many of them were involved in cataloging, especially cataloging the 613 commandments. The Smag is one of the most important, but we have several others, the Chinuch and others. Systemization, which basically refers to the taking of the entire corpus of Jewish thought and making sense of it, organizing it into chapter headings and separate books and so on. Maimonides is a classic example. And finally, in this context, resolution of apparent contradictions, which is the primary function, in my humble opinion, of Tosafot. We'll come back to who they are. Rashi's goal, however, unique in many ways among the Rishonim, is he wants to provide access. He wants to simply say, this is a very hard, difficult text. It's arcane, it's convoluted, it's opaque. What do we do with it? He holds you by the hand, offers you small, pithy comments to try and give you a sense of what does the text actually mean. Little side-by-side notes that help you work through the text. And secondly, he's also very big into integration, and by that I'm referring to specifically the integration of the written Torah and the oral Torah. The written Torah, of course, being the 5 books of Moses, the oral Torah being the much larger corpus of Jewish thought that is encapsulated in the Mishnaic works, the Midrashic works, the Talmud, texts of the Kabbalah. He wants to try and bring them together. He chooses very carefully. He anthologizes with tremendous editorial skill, finding the right balance between how much is going to be enlightening and how much will be overwhelming, and he offers that to the reader on a very basic Hebrew level, such that we can appreciate the text and its tremendous nuances. That's really the genius of Rashi, is these 2 basic ideas, allowing access to the text and integrating the various bodies of thought that apply to that text. Where did he live? As I mentioned, he comes from Ashkenaz, which is an ancient Hebrew term that refers to the land from which Chinese food comes. No, I just made that up. I'm waiting for people to laugh. How's that joke go? Is this an audience or an oil painting? No, that's okay. Boaz, you can laugh, okay? All right. Anyways, here's a map of Europe, and this map actually shows the emigration of Ashkenazic Jewry to Eastern Europe. About 70% of American Jews trace their ethnic origins to Eastern Europe, and the overwhelming majority of those Jews trace their origins to Ashkenaz. It's the term used primarily for the Rhineland in Germany, and for various reasons, which are not our discussion today, but anti-Semitism drove them towards the east, and economic opportunity was a vacuum that drew them towards the great cities of Ukraine and Poland and Lithuania. Lithuania being in the north here, of course, where Jews of unusual intelligence, fashion sense, and humor come from. So that's where, and then later many of them, by the way, emigrated down to South Africa. We occasionally get a few hangovers from Lithuania coming from South Africa. The Rhineland here is the locus classicus for the Ashkenazi Jewry and the culture that developed in Northern Europe. It is most commonly contrasted with Sephardic Jewry, which of course was still in a period of tremendous ascent. It was the golden age in Spain. That would be Sepharad or Sephardi Jewry out to the west. And there, of course, are Jewries in North Africa and in the Middle East as well that all have different ethnic groups. Rashi himself lived in several places in the lands of Ashkenaz, both in what would be contemporary France and in Germany. He studied in the great school of Rabbeinu Gershom Meir Hagola. We don't know a lot about the specifics of his life. We know that he grew up in an area of great viticulture, and he may quite likely have been involved in being a vintner himself, or at very least in the commerce dealing with wine and grapes. There are all kinds of fantastic stories and legends about his birth and his youth and so on. There are a couple different versions in which his parents, in one version of the story his father, and the other version of the story his mother, gave up the possibility of owning phenomenal profit through the sale of a jewel that was destined for the diadem of the Pope or something like that. I don't remember the exact detail of which ecclesiastical figure it was, but they really didn't want to see this beautiful jewel be used in that purpose, and so therefore they cast it into the sea in one version, and as a result there was a promise made to them in these versions of the story that they would have a child, the one child, Shlomo, who would enlighten the eyes of all Jewry. Whatever the truth of the legends are, there's no question that he grew up to be this great enlightener. There's another amazing version of a story in which his mother was in the city of Worms, and there are people who today claim to have a place in Worms where this stands to this very day, where when she was expecting, she was walking in one of these narrow hallways, corridors, and a a horse and carriage came bustling through there with tremendous speed and threatened to run her down. And so she flattened herself as much as possible against the wall. But of course, she was heavily expecting, and she would have been hurt. The baby would have hurt. So the wall, as it were, became concave in order to allow her and her unborn child to be protected as the cart went by. It's an amazing story. There's no historical grounds to believe it actually happened as said, but nevertheless it gives you a sense of what people say about him. He studied primarily in the region known as Shum, which is the tri-town of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, 3 towns that are very proximate to one another in the region of Ashkenaz. And it was there that he was able to draw together much of the scholastic methodology of the South, where you have people like Rabbeinu Gershom active, the school of Provence, with the Ashkenazi proper way, the regimen of studying the Torah with great discipline and grammatical fortitude. He then, in 1070, opened up his own yeshiva. Like many yeshivas probably today, his first students were his children and his grandchildren, and they went on to achieve great fame as well in the school of Tosafot. He had a number of daughters which have been popularized in fiction. There's very little historical data to support the specifics of the biographical depictions, although the author, Maggie Anton, did do a tremendous amount of historical research and attempted through a multiple volume series to provide a picture of the life of Jewish women in 11th century Germany with great success in many areas. There is a widespread fallacy that his daughters wore tefillin. We don't have any evidence of that whatsoever, but we do have some interesting passages in the writings of one of his illustrious grandchildren, Rabbeinu Tam, that he knew of women who did wear tefillin, and in fact they said the blessings when they put on the tefillin. The widespread idea that Rashi's daughters wore tefillin, however, does not have any classical source in the period. There's also no reason to believe the assertion that the so-called pseudo-Rashis, Rashi was so popular that many texts were authored by others and his name was attached to them. And it's very different from today's scholarly world. Today, in the academy, what we do is we take something that someone else wrote and we put our own name on it. But back then it was popular to take something that you wrote and put someone else's name on it. So we have several pseudo-Rashis, especially on the Talmud, sometimes because copyists found a manuscript without having a clear authorship, and so therefore they said, well, this looks a lot like Rashi, and so they added the word Rashi to it, but it's clearly not. So some have opined that perhaps his daughters did write some of the pseudo-Rashis. Again, there's no reason to specifically believe that, but the scattered references that we do have to his daughters indicate that they were literate, that they were learned, and that they did communicate with their father in learning, meaning they had a body of Torah knowledge which was quite impressive, especially for their day. Not surprising, perhaps, if your father is Rashi, that whatever your gender, you would be a very learned individual. His major works, we will study some of them in just a few minutes, but his commentary on the Torah is absolutely essential. It is universally printed, typically alongside the commentary of Onkelos, the translation of Onkelos that we'll study in another class. He's also written a massive commentary on almost every tractate of the Talmud, almost every book of the Tanakh. It's the very first place a scholar looks, or at any stage in their scholarly career, is what does Rashi say? How do we understand this passage? We always look towards the inside binding, which by long-standing typographical convention is where we place the commentaries of honor, the ones on the inside. Rashi's always on the inside. What does he have to say? And there's a whole engine of research in the yeshiva that is surrounding the question, what's bothering Rashi? Meaning, when Rashi says something that appears obvious, there's always a much deeper reason. Why did he bother to say something that we would otherwise know? And exploring that question of what's bothering Rashi is often quite productive as a scholarly venture. Now, at the end of his life, most of his life was lived with relative tranquility, which is not something that could be easily said about the Jews in Europe. But at the end of the 11th century, at the end of his life, really, he was an aged man, he dealt with one of the most difficult social crises of the era. This was associated with the First Crusade of 1096. The Crusades were a tremendously heart-rending period for Jews in the Rhineland in particular. It was originally a movement that began in December 1095 when Pope Urban II called upon all Christians to gather together and to free the homeland from Muslim infidels, because there was some question about access to the holy sites for pilgrims. This happened to be an incredible message. It resonated with tremendous force throughout Europe, and there were other social and economic factors that combined to bring together a formidable force of soldiers from all over Europe. And they managed to make their way, following monks like this one here, Peter the Hermit, to Jerusalem. They had to repeat it several times because the Muslims were able to throw the Crusaders off the Holy Land. And of course we have some of the most fascinating architecture in Israel from that period. But the First Crusade of 1096 was especially important from a Jewish perspective, because what happened was several of the kind of ragtag crusaders who didn't make it into the regular army, meaning they were not noblemen, they were not professionally trained knights, they were just, adventurers. In some cases, and we have many first-hand accounts from the period, they were like, hooligans, poor peasants, landless peasants. They would even do things like, if there was a goose that insisted on walking to the east, they would say that the goose was holy and they would follow the goose. Another famous crusader had his back tattooed with a cross, and he revealed his back to his audience, said, "Look, I woke up and I had this mark on my back. It obviously means you have to follow me." And so they followed him off to the Crusades. There are a lot of kind of, marginal people involved in the Crusades. And a certain number of them up here in the Rhineland said, wait a second, why are we schlepping? They didn't use that word. Maybe they did. It was Germany. Why are we schlepping all the way to Jerusalem to fight the infidel when we have the infidel right here in our very backyard? We don't have to go all the way over there to fight Muslims. We can fight Jews right here in Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. And so there were tremendous massacres of Jews in the Tri-Town that was the home of Rashi for many years, and horrible massacres which we recall every Shabbos when we read Av HaRachamim, a paragraph that's read after the Torah reading in memory of those martyrs of 1096. The reason why this was especially poignant for Rashi is because once that fateful summer had passed, we learned that many different things happened to the Jews of those communities. Many were, of course, killed outright. Many amazingly chose to take their own lives. We have some powerful first-hand accounts of Jewish families, deciding to kill their children first and then kill themselves rather than expose themselves to baptism. And then we have, of course, many Jews who chose to become baptized rather than submit to the sword. And then after the Crusades had passed, and especially because these were not legitimate crusaders, so to speak, these were not like authorized crusaders, then they found that the storm had passed and they could return to their Jewish lives. And the question was, could they return to their Jewish lives? We have to recall that this was not a period of religious fluidity when people could simply become a Zen Buddhist and then become a Muslim and then become a Christian at will. Once you left a religious community, that was it. You were gone. And so you had all these Jews who felt terrible about their choices, and they appealed to the greatest authority of the age for guidance on what they could do. Rashi, of course, was the greatest authority of the period, and he wrote in his Teshuvot, which were extremely influential, that in fact they should be completely reaccepted as Jews. There should be no prejudice against them for the decision they made when they were on pain of death, and in fact that is a decision that has had huge consequences for Jewish history. So when we reflect on the life of Rashi as a whole, we should recall that this is someone who lived a millennium ago. And how often is it that we have a figure that lived 1,000 years ago that is so influential that he still plays a very vibrant part in our intellectual lives even today? When children in first grade are learning Rashi, when scholars at the highest levels of yeshivas are studying Rashi with the same level of enthusiasm and fervor, we get a glimpse of the tremendous power of this figure. So at this point, I've finished the historical part of the presentation. I'd like to hand the microphone over to Rabbi Teitelbaum to please give us some insight into the actual texts that Rashi authored.
Thank you, Dr. Abramson. That was really marvelous. We're going to look at a couple of the comments of Rashi on the Chumash, but before we do that, we're going to just think for a moment about what the Talmud would be sans Sino, without Art Scroll, and without Rashi. People in our time have said, what a fantastic job Art Scroll has done, and they truly have, making it possible for literally all of us to open the Talmud, to read folios, to read Mesechtos, to make siyumim, and it's glorious, absolutely glorious. One needs to understand that that is what Rashi did, but I cannot even say how many times over. The Talmud was a sealed book. It was impenetrable. It was inaccessible to the common man. And that's without exaggeration. We, most of us, the vast majority, if not all of us in this room, living in the times before Rashi was written, would not have a prayer, not a chance, at studying Talmud. If not with one's teacher, master, Rebbe, page by page by page by page, line by line by line. So what Rashi did in terms of opening up the Talmud is incomparable. Everybody else's work is built upon Rashi's. That's not to say that there aren't those who will dispute Rashi, and the Tosfos, and the Rambam, and the Ran, and who will say, well, they have a different take of what this Mishnah means, a different understanding of that Gemara. Oh, of course. But in terms of being capable of navigation, nobody could make their way through the Yam HaTalmud if not for the rudder, and the sail, and the ship, and the steam engine, and what we have to say in our own time would be the nuclear power that makes the Yam HaTalmud accessible and navigable to everybody. It's the first thing we have to say about Rashi is that he has made Talmudic Judaism a reality. Because by opening up the Talmud, you are now saying that that which the Perushim began with in the Bayis Sheni, in the Second Commonwealth, continued on with Mishnah and Talmud and the period of Gaonim, about which we heard briefly. And then the Rishonim, it was that which became, for all of Klal Yisrael, Talmudic Judaism as we understand it today, Rabbinic Judaism as it's so called, that can be embraced and lived and appreciated, and it isn't foreign to us. And it's not by rote, because anybody can open up a Gemara and study. That's only because of Rashi. So that Rashi is therefore perhaps singularly responsible for the success of Rabbinic Judaism. And as we leave our focus from the Talmud, let's just note that in the case of the Talmud, in the case of Gemara, Rashi's work principally was to, as Dr. Abramson so beautifully said, take us by the hand, line by line by line, and say, well, this is what this means, and this is what the question is, and this is what the answer is. And that's particularly where, yes, the question appropriately is, what's bothering Rashi? People have authored books by that title, What's Bothering Rashi? Because there you want to know what would have been another or maybe alternative interpretation. You know, today we have a newer phrase, alternative facts. We have alternative interpretations, and so when we ask, well, what's bothering Rashi? Part of what we're saying is, what is that which Rashi says is not the understanding, such that he guides us to what he says is the understanding. So there, yes, Rashi is taking us by the hand, and it's appropriate to ask, what's bothering Rashi? He is trying to not just answer the question of what's bothering Rashi. He's answering the question of, you'll excuse me, what's bothering God? Rashi is trying to educate us to understand what the Torah is really trying to tell us on all levels, on Pshat and Remez and Drush and Sod. Rashi conveys to us the truth, the powerful truth of the fact that there are numerous planes of reality and of existence, and therefore there are similarly numerous planes and realities of meaning. Meaning doesn't have to mean literal translation. Meaning means Sod, the most profound, even mystical understanding of what God conveys to us in Torah, let alone Drash, let alone Pshat, Pardes as they are called. And the beautiful wide Pardes, that is the reality of what Hashem did when He gave us Torah. He gave us a Pardes. He gave us an entire orchard, and He said this is all for us to live with and to live by, to live in. Rashi so beautifully, therefore, is not just all about what's bothering Rashi. What is the meaning of this word? How do you understand this pasuk? Rashi is telling us what is the message of this pasuk. Why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu say it this way? To us. What's its meaning and relevance to us? Specifically to go back in time to Parshas Bereishis and to Chumash Bereishis, to a couple of citations in Shmos, because I want you and suggest that you in the Parshios moving forward, Bo, Va'era, Bo, B'Shalach, Yisra, Mishpatim, Truma, Tetzava, that you should look at Rashi now and find both that tremendous Parshanut, that tremendous idea of understanding the Parsha and understanding the textual meaning and message of the pasuk, and yet also seeing the broader sense that Rashi gives us, where he says, don't just ask me what's bothering me, ask me what's bothering God. It's not about what's bothering Rashi so much as, why is it that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells this to us? What's the bigger message? Let's take a look at a couple of Rashis. Please turn to the first Rashi in Chumash. We'll do this one quickly because this is so obvious and so well known. Page 2. I always joke that the first page of Chumash, of the stone Chumash, begins on page 2 because they wanted to imitate the Talmud, which, you have a shar blot and then the first page is Daf Beis Amud Aleph. So they started on page 2. Or is it because the Torah begins with the Beis Bereishis? So anyway, on page 2, Rashi famously says in the very beginning, the Torah really should begin with the parsha we're going to read this coming Shabbat. Amr Rabbi Yitzchak lahoy tzarich lahaschel es haTorah elo mehachodesh hazel lochem. Shehi mitzvah rishana shenitztava bo Yisrael. Rabbi Yitzchak says the Torah is a guide to life. So mitzvah number 1, hachodesh hazel lochem, Rosh Chodeshim. That's in Parshas Bo. That's where the Torah should begin. Umatam pasach bebereshis mishum, because of the pasuk in Tehillim, koyach ma'asav higid la'amay losas lahem nachlas goyim. Something important to us. Look at the Rashi almost prophetically saying, she'im yomra umas ha'olam liYisrael listim atem. When, or if, but we know it's a when, the nations of the world say, you Jews are thieves. You've conquered other people's lands, occupied territories. Hey, we answer, the land is all God's. Hu bra'a nisana la'asher yashar be'einav. B'ritzono nitna lahem, u'b'ritzono not lamehem v'nitna lanu. V'nasna lanu. So the first Rashi begins by telling us we Jewish people have a homeland. And the whole point of Bereshis bara Elokim v'shamayim v'sa'aretz is that it all belongs to God, and He has apportioned to every nation there where He wishes that nation to live. That's their portion, that's their nachla. Ours is that little piece of land along the Mediterranean. Tell that to the nations of the world. It's the first pasuk in Chumash. Now this is obviously not a simple pshat of what Bereshis bara Elokim means, but it's an obvious way in which Rashi opens his commentary almost announcing, I'm not going to write just a simple translation of Chumash. I'm going to share with you, taken from Medrash, taken from Talmud, Bavli Yerushalmi, I'm going to share with you the point, the bigger point, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is trying to make throughout the Torah. Let's take as another example. Please turn to page 94. Just briefly, as we go through the book of Bereshis with a few examples. Page 94. Tefillah, prayer, so important. Prayer is important, but so is prayer not just selfishly for oneself, but prayer generally. And no prayer goes unanswered. There's a famous Rashi in Shir Hashirim, we'll talk about it some other time, that says as much. Sometimes your prayer is just a general prayer or a prayer for someone else, but if you yourself could benefit from that for which you're praying, perhaps you will. Famous Rashi. Again, a Rashi that's conveying to us what tefillah is and what selfless tefillah is all about. Pasuk Yud Ches, the end of Siman Chav, Pasuk Yud Ches, Ki atzar Hashem ba'ad kol rechem leveis Avimelech al dvar Sarah, Eshes Avraham. Because of what Avimelech attempted to do to Sarah, everyone was barren. All of the women in Avimelech's family, they were all incapable of having children. They all became infertile. V'Hashem pakad es Sarah ka'asher amar. HaKadosh Baruch Hu granted Sarah the child he had promised. Vayas Hashem l'Sarah kasher diber. Now, we understand that it's all because of Avraham's prayer for Avimelech. Please Hashem, forgive him, for he knew not what he was doing. And let him be, and his family, and his wives, and all of them, let's allow them to once again have their children and have family life. That same prayer of Avram Avinu also is answered when the pasuk says, "V'Hashem pakad es Sarah kasher amar." Says Rashi, "Samach parsha zu lekan." The fact that the Torah, just after mentioning that Avimelech's family was again able to have children, the Torah says Sarah's son Yitzchak was born. Why? The juxtaposition? If you set yourself aside and you're just davening for what your fellow man needs, if that's what's on your mind, if that's what's on your heart, you happen to need that very same answer to a prayer, you might just be answered first. Shneimar vayispalel Avraham el Elokim vayirpo Elokim es Avimelech v'samach lei. Immediately thereafter, the Torah says, "V'Hashem pakad es Sarah ka'asher Amar. Shapakda kvar kodim sheripes Avimelech. HaKadosh Baruch Hu had already provided for pregnancy for Sarah, even before Avimelech's family was healed. But it was that timing of the matter, with Avraham's prayer at that time, that caused that at that time Sarah should become pregnant. Yes, it was promised, but at that time she became pregnant because that's when Avraham prayed for Avimelech. Sarah became pregnant at that time because her husband was praying for Avimelech, who had somewhat unwittingly taken Avraham's wife. Rashi's point: power of prayer, but not selfish prayer. Prayer for someone else. Even prayer for Avimelech. So Rashi's giving us more than the pshat. He's telling us with a bigger picture what the Torah, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wishes to convey, in this case with the order of events in the sequence in which the Pesukim appear. Let's move on to Parshas Chayei Sarah. Moral lessons Rashi is constantly teaching us, is educating us. Page 108 in Parshas Chayei Sarah. Famously, Ephron acts as if, of course, Avram, you can take the land for Ma'aras HaMachpelah. It's yours for free. Avram understood better. Vayishma Avraham el Ephron. He listens carefully. He understands Ephron's real intentions. Vayishkol Avraham le Ephron es hakesef asher diber baz nevneches arba meyos shekel kesef over lasocher. Over lasocher, meaning the most pristine, whole coins. Rashi talks about centurion, meaning the full weight of each coin. Over lasocher, accepted internationally, right? But he points out that the second time in the pasuk, not the first Ephron, the second Ephron, where it says that Avraham pays him, it's written chaser. Take a look. Vayishma Avram el Ephron with a vav. Vayishkol Avram le Ephron without a vav. He pays Ephron the money, but it's the Ephron without a vav. And he quotes the Medrash, because he's trying to tell us, Rashi's trying to convey to us the great lesson. Emor ma'at v'aseh harbeh. Exactly. Don't just talk the talk. Don't bother. Walk the walk. Chaser vav, Rashi says, pasuk tezayin, vayishkol Avram le'Ephron, chaser vav lefisha amar harbeh, va'afilu ma'at lo asa. Ephron said, oh, it's yours, but he took more than the land was worth. Shenatel mimenu shkolim gedolim shehin kanterin, shenemar over lasecher. So Rashi's point to us is, be like Avram. Be one who does in earnest, who does, and does selflessly, and not like Ephron, who talks the talk, but does nothing at all. And then finally, and this is very, very important, Rashi always is trying to give us the great moral push in interpersonal relations. There's a tremendous amount of Rashi that emphasizes the evil of Lashon Hara. And it's almost as if he tells us that's the whole point of the story of Yosef and his brothers. Take a look at the beginning of Parshas Vayeshev on page 198. Rashi is not just going to be content with telling us what it was that Yosef said about his brothers. He points out in the Rashi how each and every point of what it was that he said is revealed to us in the Pesukim, and how Yosef suffered the consequences for each aspect of the Lashon Hara that he spoke about his brothers. Rashi Divrei Amaskal Dibasam Ra'ah Pasuk Gimel in Rashi. Kol Ra'ah Shehaya Ra'ah Be'echav B'nei Leah Haya Magid La'aviv Shehaya Oichlin Evim Menachai Mazalzlin B'vnei Hashfachas L'Kreisen Avadim V'cheshudim Al HaRayos Ubishloshton laka, he was punished for each and every one. Every minachai, when they slaughtered the goat and ate it properly after slaughter. When they sold him into Avdus, obviously, when he became an Eved himself. And then Gilui Arayas, he was accusing his brothers of being licentious. Well, what happened to him? He was pursued by the wife of Potiphar and suffered through all of these step by step by step, each and every one specifically because he had accused his brothers falsely. So Rashi is trying to tell us that the greater picture of the story of Yosef and his brothers includes this tremendous lesson, this tremendous sense of how careful we have to be about our fellow Jews and how we say, how we speak about each other. Rashi again in Shmos, page 298. These are all famous Rashis. We all know these Rashis. We sometimes call them a Rashi to live by. And Rashi succeeded really in influencing, therefore, and in shaping world views of all of Jewry by this kind of a commentary on the Torah. For generations, he has created some of these foundations of our faith and of our worldview by having commented on Torah not with simple meaning but with the bigger message that he teaches us, God wants us to know. And so I believe that Rashi wanted the wider, greater Torah and its message to be conveyed to us by the words of the Torah, that his belief was that all of those midrashim and Gemara that he brings, that's all what the intention of the words of Torah were from the start. And he succeeded in profoundly influencing, therefore, what kind of religious people we are, what the religious character of the Jew who studies Chumash is all about. Thank you once again for joining us this evening.
You know, I think personally I gained a lot in terms of just getting the sense of really what's behind Rashi. And then also from the end part, we got a sense of really the values, what was really happening in Rashi's life, and the values that he was talking about, and what he was trying to get at, what's bothering God, as was talked about by Rabbi Tal about.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, I totally agree. But next week is going to be absolutely fantastic because, you know, Rashi is phenomenal. And as I said in my presentation, he really has I have a very, very great deal of affection for him on a personal level, if that's possible to say. But the Ramban, his life was so dramatic. I mean, the history is going to be amazing. Do you know much about his life?
You know, the Ramban is the one person in history I wish I could have actually met. I really, really wish I could have met. But in those times, I think to myself, well, maybe I actually do know him. Because the more you learn about him, you see this character who is so three-dimensional, who is so emotional and intellectual at the same time. And then you realize the backdrop of what his life was. And when he says this, it's almost like you really are meeting him.
Well, what do you plan to talk about next week?
So one of the things which I like to talk about is the Ramban. When one looks at the Ramban, there's so many opportunities of what to start with. He's so prolific. But there's just a number of places which really capture who he was, what he was dealing with, and the depth of his perception, whether it be talking about afterlife, whether it talk about his interactions with people of his time before he got expelled from Spain, the great debate of the Ramban. When we're talking about some of the aspects of when he arrives in Israel and how that reforms his perspective on the Pirush he was giving from far away Spain. There's so much to talk about this incredible individual.